And so here in New Zealand in 2023, we've just elected a national government who are going to return to the policies that they used to have, which have created all the homelessness in New Zealand and opened up the market to foreign buyers.
One, at the moment, Chinese buyers are totally banned from purchasing houses in New Zealand.
But it's National's foreign buyer tax that kept coming back into the spotlight.
There is huge demand from people who want to buy expensive luxury homes in New Zealand, and they're going to come back and I'm going to tax them.
Subsequently talk to people about tax treaties, because the view on tax treaties is that it does depend on whether or not the foreign buyer charge is seen as a tax or not.
Stop the squeezed middle. It's all predicated on mass immigration and a house price bubble. Otherwise, none of those figures stack up.
And so this is a view that comes from John Key down to Christopher Luxton, who both have affiliations through the Air New Zealand board. And so here we have the same internationalist policy being run by the national government today.
Former Prime Minister Sir John Key has slammed a decision by a top US lawmaker to visit Taiwan and says America is mainly responsible for causing the current diplomatic tension with China. Meanwhile, China has continued aggressive military exercises near Taiwan. Here's Q&A's Jack Tate.
Overnight, China continued military exercises in the Taiwan Strait, simulating an attack. A response to a decision by US House Leader Nancy Pelosi, who this week became the most senior American political figure to visit Taiwan in the last 25 years.
In my opinion, it was reckless, if you want to be kind. It was provocative, and it was actually dangerous. But everyone knows that if the third most important elected official in the United States turns up on Taiwanese territory, that is poking the bear. And the question is, for what benefit?
As Prime Minister, John Key's government fostered a close relationship with China. He met with President Xi Jinping on several occasions. But since then, the relationship between China and the West has become more complex.
They've been incredibly assertive in the South Pacific. Hong Kong has lost, in the eyes of many, the independence, for want of a better term, that it enjoyed previously. You have the human rights abuses in Xinjiang. I'm going to ask you that question one more time. What responsibility does China bear for all of this?
Yeah, so let's call a spade. Most people would disagree with me.
And so what's up with the National Party pushing this idea of allowing the Chinese back into New Zealand? And the answer to that question is to do with pushing up the GDP and creating a fake growth in the housing market for the economy to make a political party look good, which is exactly what the National Party did under John Key. Meanwhile, they're selling out our industries to the Chinese, and they're coming in and buying up our housing markets and pushing it up out of the reach of ordinary New Zealanders. And so let's begin by looking at the threat of war with China.
And what scares the US military is that China is rapidly modernizing and expanding their military. China's military is growing incredibly fast. Like, they deploy the equivalent of an entire new British Navy every 4 years. Every 4 years, it's like new British Navy, like new Royal Navy every 4 years. Yeah, they're just growing very quickly. This report is concerned about China's growing strength and military footprint. How China is coercing its neighbors, disregarding ocean boundaries, testing missiles, bullying fishing vessels in other countries' waters, building islands and military bases on those islands, and flying over other countries' airspace. And especially in Taiwan, the island that China claims as their own and where the globe gets nearly all of their advanced microchips, which is a topic I made an entire video about. The point is, Taiwan is an incredibly important island for the United States. All of this together makes China, quote, the only country that has the intent and power to actually challenge the US-led global order and rewrite global rules and norms, something the US has gotten really comfortable doing over the last 70 years. So this is why the US considers China the most consequential strategic competitor for coming decades. And they've created a plan to respond. And in their words, we cannot delay. They give themselves this 10-year window to implement some major changes. And this is what it looks like. Okay, first things first. The US military is already very present in Asia. We've got about 8,000 troops in Guam. We've got over 100 bases in Japan with about 21,000 American troops on the mainland and another 24,000 stationed down here on the Japanese island of Okinawa. Go up to South Korea and you'll find 22,000 US troops. And then you've got the US Navy who operates out of this port in Singapore. This has been the status quo in Asia for decades, and it has been the way that the US has ensured security for its allies. And it's kind of mostly worked to help secure American interests and deter conflict. The US has maintained strong alliances in this region. And frankly, the Pentagon has kind of been distracted with other things. 2 wars that happened in the Middle East over the past 20 years.
My fellow citizens, my fellow citizens, my fellow citizens.
But as those conflicts wind down, and as China militarizes, the Department of Defense says that this status quo, all of these troops in Asia, it's not enough. They talk about this new kind of deterrence. Integrated deterrence. The only kind of military posture that will actually keep China at bay. And this is what it looks like. The smallest part of the strategy has to do with American bases. They're going to reopen a base in Guam and move some troops there. But the majority of this strategy has to do with American allies in Asia. Allies that are in lockstep with the US's goal to deter and contain China. The Pentagon calls partnering with its allies the center of gravity for this strategy. So let's start with Japan, one of the US's closest allies in the region. Japan is a country that is deeply concerned about a more powerful China, with its massive navy and its ambitions to control Taiwan. And it's very easy to forget that Japan isn't just this. It's actually all of this. It extends way down here because of all these islands. These islands curve nicely all the way down till they hit Taiwan. All of these are Japanese islands. I mean, if you look at Japan's national defense strategy, translated into English, you will see something that looks strikingly similar to what the Pentagon released. They're both really freaked out about China, and they both are ready to act in lockstep to deter a more aggressive China in the region. So it starts up here with that island that we talked about at the beginning, Magashima, this new military base and airstrip to be used by both Japanese and US militaries. Further south is Amami Island, where Japan has recently added long-range missiles and anti-ship missiles. Potentially they're going to add cruise missiles. These are missiles that they're buying from the United States. These are missiles that are definitely in range of the Taiwan Strait. Next in the chain is Okinawa, where the US has a huge presence of tens of thousands of troops already. Japan also has military bases here and is adding even more long-range missiles and electronic warfare units, which are military installations meant to disrupt and deny communication signals. On these 2 islands down here, they're adding even more long-range missiles, which could potentially be used to attack Chinese naval ships and aircraft. And Japan is placing nearly 600 troops on Ishigaki as well. And finally, you've got this last militarized island in the chain, Yonaguni. It's the closest island to Taiwan. And here Japan is adding more of those electronic warfare units, which are used to jam communication signals or to listen in on their communications. You know, they're right next to China. Japan is also positioning more troops here. So this is the first part of our chain. And when paired with training that Japan and US troops are doing to simulate island and amphibious warfare, it sends a really strong signal to China that Japan is ready to respond if needed. This line also serves as like a physical barrier that any Chinese ship or submarine would have to pass through in order to access the Pacific Ocean. It's a line that Japan can easily control and monitor. And it also builds a wall of missiles. Any calculus that China is making on whether or not to invade Taiwan or to do anything in the region will have to now factor in this wall of missiles ready to roll. Overall, this increased military presence on this chain of islands gives Japan, and by extension the United States, the ability to monitor communications and troop movements of China, preparing them to act quickly. And it also gives them the ability to pre-position troops and supplies throughout the region, which is a major logistical advantage. But all of this comes with a massive price tag. So Japan, which is formerly a pacifist nation without like a huge military, is actually planning to double their defense spending. They're spending way more on buying weapons than they ever have before, and 97% of those weapons are coming from the United States. The island chain strategy continues down here with the Philippines, close to Taiwan and close to the South China Sea. The US knows that it needs to bolster its presence here, but it's not as straightforward as it is in Japan. The Philippines was a US colony for decades. It's a very sensitive history. And even after Filipino independence, the US maintained a military presence in the Philippines until like the 90s. And then they eventually kicked out the US, as many saw it as just an enduring legacy of US colonialism. But a more aggressive China has become a major threat to the Philippines. Now listen, I'm not going to go into like a full South China Sea thing here, but just know that China claims all of this as their maritime boundary. It's literally a line with 9 dashes that some Chinese official in 1948 drew by hand on a map. This line blasts through the boundaries that the rest of the world recognizes as the Filipino territorial waters. So there's a conflict in the ocean. And now, on a daily basis, Filipino fishing vessels are harassed by Chinese military vessels who threaten them if they don't leave their waters. In 2022, China put a temporary stop to all fishing in the South China Sea, denying the Philippines' ability to fish in the West Philippine Sea, which is rightfully their waters. But it's crazier than that. The Chinese Navy is like full-blown just bullying the Philippines. They like show up with lasers to harass and blind Filipino ships. I mean, let's remember, the Philippines is a much smaller nation than China and doesn't really have a navy even close to what China has. So now they're in this impossible decision. They have to choose between giving up their sovereignty and fishing rights to their aggressive neighbor, China, or partnering with their former colonizer who also wants to repel China. And in this case, they chose the latter.
China has pushed too hard. It's pushed the Philippines in the South China Sea, what they call the West Philippine Sea.
The Philippines is planning to boost its military presence in the disputed South China Sea.
It started in 2014 when they allowed the US back in for the first time in 22 years. The US presence will technically be in bases that are owned by the Philippines, but the US can have troops, build barracks, and other military installations, and can have pre-positioned supplies there as well. It's basically like the US has bases there, but it's like, shh, it's actually the Philippines. And as part of all of this that we've been talking about, in late 2022, they expanded their agreement, giving the US military access to 4 more bases, bringing the total number of bases on the Philippines up to 9. And look where they selected to put them, here in the north of the country, strategically close to Taiwan, and helping fill their gap in their island chain that they're creating. This now allows US to have a military presence really close to Taiwan. The US trains very closely with their Filipino counterparts, making them ready to respond very quickly to an invasion in Taiwan, while also repelling Chinese bullying of Filipino fishing activity. Okay, so now the island chain is filling out, giving the US and its regional partners a solid blockade to the Pacific. And it continues all the way down around the South China Sea because of the US presence in Singapore. This is a very united front.
And so I wonder whether or not John Key is actually an agent of the Chinese government, because remember, he is a banker. He owns shares in the Bank of America, which has shares in the banks in New Zealand and in China. And so he's trying to promote the Chinese Communist government.
The point is that for your numbers to work, you have to increase the number of foreign buyers almost tenfold from 2018 before that ban was lifted. That's fantastical.
And so it's time now for New Zealanders to wake up and see what's going on, because there is a war imminent with China.